Hello. This presentation was originally given at the Realizing Resistance 3 conference on the expanding universe on May 5th, 2023. I'm talking here about the narrative theory of Andor and Rogue One, specifically on this idea of writing until what I'm calling the dead end. So I basically have two lenses that I'm coming from, narrative theory and genre theory. I'm going to discuss a little bit about the two types of closure that I'll be talking about. Also thinking about audience expectations and what that means for the characters of Jyn Erso and Cassian Andor. And then essentially my claim about Star Wars becoming a pseudo-genre. So we start Star Wars, the very first movie made, with an ending. The rebel spies steal the plans. A narrative is ended. That's the beginning of Star Wars, is an ending. So I think it's really helpful to kind of situate ourselves where I'm going to be talking from to try and get us to that ending. So I come from the world of composition and rhetoric. So I am really ingratiated into genre theory, which really exists more in the writing studies world and writing instruction world than anywhere else. But essentially, it's talking about how textual patterns are socially constructed and identified. This is not genre like horror, romance. This is genre like an email is a genre, a tweet is a genre. But it will get confusing because I'll also use the other definition of genre in this presentation. The other thing I'm going to be kind of pulling from is narrative theory. This is, of course, the idea that there are storytelling elements that shape our perception and communication that reoccur over and over and over. So one of these ideas of narrative theory is the idea of closure or ending. And there's basically two different types of closure that I'm really thinking about here. The first is this sense of completeness, like a real ending to a narrative, the story is finished. And then a stylistic closure, the conclusion of the genre. The book has to have a last page. The book has to end. And sometimes your narrative doesn't end when your book does, right? So the difference between a narrative end and then a genre conclusion, right? The thematic closure, the character goals and events get played out, and then sort of a stylistic closure that the exact expected format and devices of the ending are finished. Roll credits. So the reason that this works, the reason you can set up an ending like this is if you keep in mind the background of your audience and the specific context that they're engaging with, where the historical context of your audience is, you can establish an ending of a film where these two things exist. They both exist. And Star Wars has one up on a lot of other things because it's basically the ur text of American culture, kind of like our Shakespeare. And you can have shows where there aren't any Jedi, but people can talk about Jedi. And even if you've never seen Star Wars, you probably have a pretty good idea. But there is a problem that emerges, especially in Rogue One, because there's a disjointedness between the stylistic and thematic closures. The thematic closure, it would be Jyn and Andor die on the beach at Scarif. Their story is over. Their narrative arc is concluded. But that's not how Rogue One ends. Rogue One ends with the beginning of A New Hope. So the stylistic closure of the movie doesn't match the thematic closure. Andor, on the other hand, got to learn from Rogue One's mistakes in a way, with the caveat that, of course, it's a TV show. It gets more room to thrive here. But that ending scene where Luthen gives this monologue is incredibly powerful as both a thematic and a stylistic ending. We feel closure with the end of season 1. We feel like this is a good place to pause the narrative and end the season, the stylistic ending. But also thematically, it ties up a lot of the narrative that had been discussed in Andor. This idea of what would you give up? How far would you go? What would you sacrifice? And I think that that really is the key theme that's emerging in Andor is how do you actually get a revolution to get started in the first place? So you have to keep in mind the audience expectation, right? It's audience expectation that drives everything from genre theory to narrative theory. The problem with writing to a dead end, writing to a known conclusion, right? We already know Cassian and Jyn have to die. No matter what, we know when and where and why they die. The only thing that makes it so people want to watch is basically this information gap. They're interested in the things they do not know. So as long as you manage that information gap well, they're going to be interested in the story. And you can be less concerned about them worrying about where the narrative will end, because we already know, but more interested in what is stopping the narrative from keeping going. What is the thing that stops them from their story continuing on? Because the expectation is everyone dies. We already have this expectation. We have to be able to fill in the gaps. So how do you make a compelling narrative, knowing that death is the only possible ending and it's already been prescribed? How do you even do that? And I think that what they do with both Rogue One and Andor is they focus on the character. They pick protagonists who are apathetic, beaten down, indifferent people with the knowledge that there's no way to win, so why even try? And this is a really big shift from the other characters in the series, right? We don't have to have the naive farmer boy who goes off on a grand adventure. We don't need to be onboarded to the story anymore. We're already immersed in what Samuel Delany would call the reading protocol, right? We already understand the genre norms of Star Wars. We already understand how everything works. We know what a Jedi is. We know a lightsaber. We know in general how spaceships work. So we don't need to focus on that so much, and we can focus on character. So let's first start with Jyn. By the way, I'm very upset that they cut this line from the movie. I thought it was campy and great and shouldn't have just been in the trailer. But Jyn kind of is leading us to where they'll eventually go with the character of Finn, right? This is the question of what happens if not everyone in the Empire is on board, right? What if there are people who are coerced or forced to be there? And I think that Rogue One just suffers a little bit because it doesn't have enough room to kind of flesh out Jyn as a full character. She's a little flat. And Cassian gets that room to breathe. But really, Cassian's not that likable of a guy. It's really Diego Luna that makes him likable, right? He does a lot of bad things for kind of bad reasons. He's not very nice to his friends or really good to them in any way. It kind of doesn't even make sense that he has friends in the first place. I'm not really sure. But I think that narrative designer Matt Colville says it best. If this is a show about how people get radicalized, if you're going to tell that story, the best character to pick is the one who's hardest to radicalize. The person who is the most checked out, the least likely to belong to a community, and the least likely to want to be involved. But by having Jyn and Andor be these characters, we get a little bit of room to breathe. Andor gets to be a heist, and then a prison break, and then a revolution. Rogue One kind of gets these similar arcs as well, but the prison break is like 30 seconds, and the heist is the majority of the movie. And I think this is because they don't need to ingratiate us into the genre anymore, right? Star Wars has kind of become its own pseudo-genre. You can play within the Star Wars world and tell whatever kind of story that you want. This is sort of evidence also with The Mandalorian, right? That's like a serial Western in a way. They're not trying to do Star Wars, which I think is one of the downsides of what happened with the sequel trilogy, is they were trying too hard to make everyone be Star Wars. So ultimately, my claim is what I'm really thinking about here is that Andor gets to critique incarceration, colonialism, industrialization, terrible choices that you have to make when you're fighting back, building on the themes of Rogue One. It gets the room to do all this because it's writing to a dead end. Because we don't have to be concerned with the narrative. We don't have to be concerned with the stylistic closure or the thematic one. It gets more room to thrive. And Jyn, her story is a little bit more constrained, right? We have to have a fighting chance. We have to be hopeful because the end of Rogue One is literally the beginning of a new hope. Andor doesn't have to worry about that. Andor can be about having no chance of survival, thinking that there's no way to win and fighting like hell anyways. And that's really where Andor shines, because people want to see the fight like hell anyways. That's why people love Star Wars in the first place. So really, I'm kind of arguing that Star Wars has this sort of genre convention that's emerging within its universe of writing these different stories that fill in the gaps that are writing to a known ending. Even thinking of the Clone Wars TV show, right? We know how that ends, but because we know how it ends, we can play more in character and not be so concerned with the stylistic closure. So Cassian and Jyn, their stories in the show, in the film, get the room to critique these oppressive systems in a way that the main films, just sort of broad condemnation of fascism, couldn't. Thank you for listening to this presentation.